afternoon and welcome to this seminar. We're very lucky today to have Craig Kuziemsky come and speak to us. Craig's a Canadian, which is a plus because we're all part of the Commonwealth and share a queen. As you can see from the bio, Craig is a sort of a, it says you're a young researcher, but you know, I think...
Young's a relative term.
Yeah. Craig's focus is going to be on collaborative design in healthcare, and I thought, you know, I would just reflect on what I know of you, Craig, and I remember a lunch or a coffee break at MedInfo in Copenhagen a few years ago, and Craig came and chatted to us, and he was sort of twitching. He said, "I've just been to another patient safety talk, you know. First there's the iceberg, and then there's the Swiss cheese model. Just kind of just cut to this, just give us like a Swiss cheeseburger," he said. And then, you know, the lights turned on and we write our Christmas piece for the BMJ, and I'm really scared that, you know, in 100 years' time, the only thing people will remember of our work is the Swiss cheeseburger. Anyway, enough ado. I really look forward to your talk, and welcome.
Okay, thank you, Enrico. So again, yeah, thanks to Enrico and certainly and Andrew and Joanna, people I've been chatting with for a few years about wanting to come out here. So I'm actually thrilled that I finally made it. So as Enrico said, what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about, you know, healthcare delivery, healthcare transformation, framed around the notion of, you know, what I call collaboration spaces, and I'll kind of get into that in the midst of the talk. So what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of background on collaboration, because it's a popular term you hear in healthcare delivery, but I think there's a real lack of understanding around what do we actually mean by that. So I'll give you a little bit of an insight as to what I think collaboration is, a little bit on kind of this current state of the knowledge on collaboration, and then I'll focus a little bit on some of the challenges in designing for it, because it's one thing to try and understand what it is. It's even harder to try and design systems in order to support collaboration. And then I'll kind of go into what I refer to as collaboration spaces, which is really the work that myself and my colleagues are doing on trying to better understand how collaboration works, and then subsequently how do we design technologies to try and support it. So I'm going to give you two questions to ponder. This is not an exam. You don't have to hand it in or anything like that. But as I talk, just kind of on the top of your head, ask yourself, okay, what is collaboration? So, you know, if you walked into a hospital today and you went to a focus group and they said, what do you think collaboration is? What would you say? And then the second one is, you know, subsequent to the first one, what are the components of it? So once you sort of think about what it actually is, you know, what is it composed of? What is the structure? What is the concepts of it? Because that's really going to be the highlight for a lot of what I'm going to discuss. Okay, so let's start with a couple of commissions and frameworks. So those of us that have been in informatics for a while or done health systems research, we've no doubt seen some of the Institute of Medicine reports. You know, of course, the To Err is Human report that came out in 1999 that sort of showed the medical errors are quite prominent. The Crossing the Quality Chasm report in 2001 that highlighted that the healthcare system is a little bit disconnected, and in order to provide, you know, safe, patient-centered care, we need to try and connect the system a little bit more. And then this one that just came out, well, I guess it was a few years, 5 years ago now, on health IT and patient safety, where it basically said there still are significant patient safety issues, and in order to overcome those issues, you know, we need regulation, we need standards. And then the one thing that I like about IOM reports is they don't just tell us what the problem is, they try and give us some insight as to at least how to address them. And in this case they said, well, you know, safety is not going to happen on its own. We need an infrastructure in place that supports, you know, a learning healthcare system to try and improve what we do to overcome safety issues. And I think we can make the same argument for collaboration, in that collaboration won't happen on its own, it won't happen overnight, but rather we really need some sort of an infrastructure in place to enable us to better, you know, really better understand and better provide collaborative care delivery in the context of how healthcare delivery works. So a second study that I'll talk about briefly actually came out of Canada. There was kind of a think tank, healthcare forum, whatever you want to call it, called the Health Council of Canada. They've actually disbanded. And this was actually the last report that the Health Council of Canada put out back in September 2013. And the key points that I liked out of it, so they say, you know, regardless of what we think about healthcare delivery, you know, I can't comment as much about Australia, but certainly in Canada, they said, you know what, we actually do clinical tasks quite well. If you go to the hospital, you know, you might be getting surgery, you could be getting x-ray, some type of procedure. We do that fairly well, and they argue that there's a fairly strong premise of evidence-based medicine that provides the evidence for a lot of how that's done. So you come in there with a particular set of symptoms, a particular illness, they've got evidence as to what the best treatment protocols are for that particular illness. However, they say evidence on the management of healthcare is far less developed. So again, as we think about collaboration, as we think about designing for collaboration, it's true, we really don't have evidence on how to do that. We introduce electronic health record systems, we introduce computer physician order entry systems, we introduce communication systems, but we don't really have a lot of evidence saying for this particular type of collaboration, this system would be ideal. For this type of unit that needs to collaborate, this type of system would be ideal. So that evidence is really lacking on a lot of what we focus on with respect to informatics. And then I like the term, one of the other things that they say is we need to do the business of healthcare differently. And by business, they're not necessarily referring to accounting and finance and marketing like traditional business, but rather I think the business that they're referring to is really what we do in informatics and what we do in health systems research. So I thought it was a really nicely framed piece. I said it's unfortunate that they're no longer in existence, but at least I think they went out in style. So as a background, I always tell my grad students, regardless of what you're studying, you need to have some sort of an anchor point that you use to really position what kind of the work you do and sort of why you do it. So as we look at healthcare transformation, I see it through the lens of collaborative healthcare delivery and connectivity. So to me, as I see us trying to become more connected, more collaborative, I see that as really being the driving force towards healthcare change and healthcare transformation. So, from my perspective, our ability to bring about healthcare transformation will only be as good as our ability to sort of develop and design for collaboration. Now, we know that trying to re-engineer healthcare, it's tough. I mean, I showed you just a couple of reports. We could probably have an entire seminar on reports and commissions saying how healthcare should change, what we should do. So despite all these reports, we're still probably not quite where we want to be. One thing that we do know is that technology alone is not going to take us where we want to go with respect to healthcare transformation. The United Kingdom a few years back had a very good example of that when they pulled the plug on their National Health Service Connecting for Health initiative, where they'd already spent, I think it was about 14 billion pounds at that point, and they pulled the plug on it just because they realized that the technology alone wasn't getting them where they wanted to be. And I kind of applaud them for sort of realizing that. We're in Canada, we're still kind of shoveling money at the dying embers that are the Canada Pan-Canadian Electronic Health Record. So I appreciate that the UK realized it wasn't working as they wanted, and they kind of cut the ties at that point. So why is collaboration important? Well, a lot of what we do in healthcare, handovers, transfers, chronic disease management, etc., these are all collaborative activities. So, they may not be designated as a collaborative activity per se, but we've got multiple people, we've got multiple disciplines, multiple professions. A lot of times these happen across time and space, so they're evidently collaborative initiatives. We also know that the increased prevalence of chronic illness, chronic disease management, there's studies showing that team-based collaborative care delivery actually enhances our ability to provide care in these settings, patient-centered care being another example. So a lot of what we do in healthcare is in fact collaborative. Now, one of the challenges is, okay, we know there's a lot of collaborative care that takes place, but how do we actually design for it? So we're designing for collaboration. Well, it ends up being a challenge because for a lot of the things that I just talked about that define collaboration, that also makes designing for it very difficult. So a lot of it is unstructured, there's ad hoc events, it's dynamic, we can't always predict what's going to happen. Ida Thren's group has a very nice definition they call co-agency, saying anytime you bring together people, technologies, and different processes, it can ultimately be challenging with respect to how we try and put things together. And studies that have looked at how to try and design systems for collaboration, they haven't exactly agreed. So Madhu Reddy's group, a little while back, they did a study and they said even though we may not design an order entry system or an electronic health record for collaboration, they can actually support collaborative tasks more than we intended. Except a year before that, David Doerr's group out of Columbia did, I think it was systematic review on EHRs, and they said, well, they're actually designed better to support individual tasks as opposed to collaboration. So we can't quite agree on how design for collaboration should actually work. Now, other challenges in designing for collaboration, I think if we kind of summarize them, there's probably 4 key ones that I think are important. We know that if we simply try and automate a particular context, it's likely not going to do what we want. Elizabeth Brickey and a whole bunch of others have done a lot of work on technology-induced errors, basically showing that even though the technology may fix 1 or 2 things, may do some things we want, you have these technology-induced errors that kind of gives us things we don't want. Jeffrey Braithwaite's group a few years back showed that a lot of times how we tend to restructure healthcare delivery, we don't really have a clear vision of what we want to do. So we kind of shuffle the deck chairs a little bit, but without knowing exactly where we want to go, it's pretty hard to get there. Enrico Carrera had a very nice paper a couple of years back in BMJ where he talked about how healthcare struggles in a state of inertia where we've almost got so many processes that if we don't sort of remove some of the more redundant or the older types of processes, we're probably not going to get where we want to go. And that in a way defines how collaboration currently works. And as a lot of the studies that I've seen, we tend to have a little bit of a hybrid of old and new. So we haven't got the old ones out of the way quick enough yet. We're trying to bring in new processes, and we kind of end up with these clunky hybrids that don't exactly work as we want. And I think one of the really overarching challenges comes down to evaluation in that, classic metrics, they're not really applicable. They're not good metrics for trying to measure what we want to do. So, in Canada, a lot of the metrics we use for healthcare delivery, we measure how many patients we move through the system, we measure how many services we provide, but that doesn't really give us any idea of whether or not we're actually, providing collaborative care delivery or doing it in a good way. It sort of counts how many patients come in the door and how many leave, but it doesn't really tell us anything about the care they get when they're in that system. So, if we summarize that, what do we know about collaboration? Well, we know it's a common objective in a whole bunch of reports and commissions. We know that there's a lot of research on various aspects of collaboration. So people have done studies on, medical education for teams. They've done studies on teamwork. There's a lot of research that's been done on handovers, discharges, and things like that. And then we also know that David Bates had a nice position paper in the IME yearbook last year where he said that, collaboration, coordination, and technology design, that may in fact be the next big opportunity for informatics. So we know it's important. People are talking about it, people are studying it. But what do we not know about it? Well, I think probably the most fundamental shortcoming is there's really a lack of explicit studies on collaboration and little insight on how to design for it. So we may study collaboration as sort of almost like a component of care delivery, but there's very few studies that actually go in and explicitly look at how collaboration works. A very nice paper from Bentin and Carson groups from a few years back, they said one of the things we need to consider in designing for collaboration, they said it's not just a matter of putting a new interface on existing systems, but rather it's probably actually going to take a whole new strategy or approaches for system design. We know that there's workflow models for supporting kind of clinical workflows. These models work quite well for individual providers, but a few studies have shown that if we try to scale these individual workflows up to collaborative teams, they don't tend to work as well. So there's workflow issues. And I think ultimately the biggest problem is we really need to address what I call the bounding issue. I mean, collaboration is so big, it can be so broad, that we don't really have an understanding of what it comprises, what the components are of it, and subsequently it becomes a lot more challenging with respect to how to design and how to try and evaluate for it. So what I'm trying to do in the research that myself and my colleagues are doing is we're sort of looking at this notion of collaboration spaces as really our answer to that bounding issue. What does that collaboration space look like? What are the components in it? And then how does that give us insight that allows us to better design and better evaluate for collaboration. So some of the work that Enrico has done over the years, he tends to a lot of times emphasize the importance really of studying the spaces where people work, where they exchange information, where care delivery takes place, where people and processes interact. So the collaboration spaces idea sort of trickles down from that. We know there's been a lot of studies that have said, well, we need to look at implementation, we need to look at context, because that's where a lot of our focus needs to be. And then I think, sort of trickling down from that, we really need an explicit focus on the people, the processes, the technologies, the policies, etc., that define collaborative healthcare delivery. So the research that I'm doing on collaboration spaces, I'm going to structure it kind of into two pieces. It kind of borrows from a paper from Matthew Press's group in the United States based upon the Accountable Care Act, where they said, well, it's important to certainly have a structure because, again, you have to know what the pieces are and you have to line the pieces up in order to try and achieve an outcome. However, regardless of how well we may put the pieces together, the behavior really determines how things work within that structure. So even though we may have a really, really good structure, if we don't consider and don't align the behavioral aspects of a system, we're probably not going to get the outcomes that we ultimately want. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the structure work that my research group has done. So one of the first things we did, and this was a paper we had in the AIHI Symposium a couple of years ago, and a paper that just came out a couple of months ago, we essentially built an ontology where we looked at how team-based collaboration works. So you probably can't read that, so I circled three key things. So it talks about patient-related concepts and relations. We've got team-related concepts and relations, and then we talk about workflow-related concepts and relations. And what this ontology is, it's really our way of laying out what happens in a collaborative team-based workflow. So, we've got a team comprised of members, there's leadership in the team, and as a patient comes in with a particular condition, some workflow drives what that team ends up being, and then subsequently from that workflow, it leads to things like communication practices, information exchange, etc. So with respect to communication, one of the challenges I think in team-based communication is a lot of it happens, somewhat informally. So Charlotte Tang's group, I know Paul Gorman was on that chapter, they said that even though we may explicitly develop things like order entry systems, electronic patient records, a lot of the communication that happens in collaborative teams tends to be verbal, tends to be email, tends to be notes. So that presents a challenge in trying to facilitate communication. So these are some of the things that we tried to highlight in this in the ontology to be able to say, okay, here's where communication tends to be a bit more informal. Here's where they may tend to go to an EPR and do things that are a little bit more formal. So it's our way of trying to lay out all these pieces. Another component that we've looked at is what we call users and tasks. Because one of the other challenges in trying to designate team activities is assigning people the tasks. So this is something we really struggled with. So what we came up with is a notion of capabilities and competencies, where a particular team member may have a particular capability to do something, but they may also have a competency that says how well they're able to do that task. So by aligning people with respect to what they can do and how well they can do it, then as tasks get allocated, you can say this task requires a particular capability with a minimum competency score, which is then how we go about assigning particular team members to particular tasks. So then trying to operationalize the ontology and the workflow that I just showed you, this is an example of what the paper that we had in AIHI a couple of years ago. We worked with a palliative care team on palliative care pain management. So we got a pain management workflow. We the clinicians identified where different types of user groups or team members may work. So, there's an occupational therapist, there's a nurse, there's a physician, there's a pharmacological therapy planning. And then we essentially took that ontology and then implemented it, using the team management, the patient pain management workflow. And then one of the other aspects that we put in the pain management workflow was we incorporated the notion of patient preferences. So what we did was we said, okay, some patients may want different types of therapies. So some patients prefer to have therapies that make them more drowsy. Some patients prefer to be less drowsy. So we incorporated that into the workflow as a way of trying to bring patient preferences into what we do. So then depending on what the patient's preference for a particular type of therapy is, it then drives the workflow, which subsequently drives which team members are involved, how communication happens, and things like that. Okay, so that's the structural aspect. I find the behavior far more interesting because, again, going back to Press's study, regardless of how well we lay things out in the workflow, regardless of how well the pieces are together, the behavior is really what determines why things work or why they don't. If I kind of summarize the work I'm doing on collaboration behaviors, there's really two key elements of it. The first one is kind of what I call rules of engagement. So again, as these different providers come together at different times, how do we understand why things may work in a particular situation, why they may not work in a particular situation. The other thing that I'm quite interested in is what I call the individual collaborative interchange, because again, as you move from individual work practices to collaborative practices, it tends to be a bit of a challenge because individuals sometimes don't like giving up some of the autonomy they have, and thus they may be a bit of resistance. So the movement from being, working in an individual workflow to working in a collaborative workflow tends to be a little bit of a negotiation. So some of the work that I've been doing kind of on that individual collaborative interchange, a lot of it has been around the notion of common ground, which refers to the knowledge, the beliefs, the language, the practices that people need in order to work collaboratively. So some of the early work that I did, so some of the work that Larry Varpio and I did a few years back, we identified when common ground is needed, what moments are of common ground, things like that. And then a study that my grad student Alex Cornett and I did a few years back, what we did was we wanted to look at what different types of common ground are. So we said, okay, as this team works together, where are instances where they kind of don't work together as well as they probably should? So, one of the things we looked at was common ground around sort of the technology, be it an electronic health record or order entry system that they're using. Because I think, if you summarize common ground, a collaborative team is really only as strong as the weakest link, right? And, one of the examples in this was I did a study on a perioperative system where when clinicians are entering data, if they put the data, or if they can't find the field where the data entry needs to go, what they would typically do is they put into a memo field. That presented a bit of a challenge because a lot of times people didn't know to look in the memo field. So, if you have a team of 5 people, if 4 people can find the correct field to enter the data and the 5th person can't, it may cause a problem because a lot of times people may not look in the memo fields. They'll look in the field where the proper data entry is supposed to be. They don't see any data entry. They assume there's no entry on the patient in that particular field, and then something potentially significant ends up being missed. So we sort of outlined, common ground around technology. We identified, common ground around processes. Because again, as you go from an individual to a collaborative team, everybody really has to be on the same page with respect to how processes are done. Because again, if an individual is struggling with a process, they may develop a workaround, they may do something else, and then that workaround can potentially have ripple effects on how the team ultimately works. So aside from kind of the earlier work that I just talked about on different types of common ground, the more recent work that I've been doing, I'm far more interested in really how common ground develops. Because again, kind of, just going back to the example about, the technology, one of the things that became quite obvious was, okay, common ground doesn't happen overnight. There's some sort of a development trajectory and how it works. And if we can understand how it develops, the stages it goes through, that then in theory should enable us to design metrics, develop interventions to try and facilitate that development of common ground. So the study that my colleague Tracy O'Sullivan and I just published last year, the study actually used a population community health type of setting where they wanted to develop kind of a common database to facilitate community resilience. So if a disaster is going to occur, be it an earthquake or a flood or something like that, they wanted really a collaborative database that would outline where particular resources are, who has expertise in things like, say, first aid and things like that. So the community had to work collaboratively in order to try and do that. And I think one of the first things that we realized was, okay, even though you may put people together to collaborate, they don't just start collaborating initially. Initially, people have their guard up a little bit. They're willing to coordinate with each other, but they're not quite at the level of collaboration. Then from coordination, they may start to cooperate a little bit. And then once they become more comfortable with people, they start to develop what we call rules of engagement. And then and only then, they tended to move into collaboration. So there certainly was this stepwise trajectory that we saw with respect to how common ground forms. One of the other things that we identified that we thought was interesting was that even though we were looking at group-based collaboration, it still had an individual component in it, because even though you're trying to develop a group, what we found was that you still have to actually develop individuals, because if you sort of leave individuals alone and just focus on group activities, sometimes individuals may feel slighted, they may not be as willing to work collaboratively. So even though your ultimate goal is to try and facilitate group-based collaboration, it still has a very strong individual component to it. We also saw things like context being an important influencer. Obviously, common ground development wasn't the same in all settings. It differed across different communities. And I think one of the most important takeaways was that developing things like common ground, well, it takes time and it comes with a developmental cost. It has a pretty high level of overhead. So, if you know that collaboration is really where you want to get to, well, then it's okay to incur that overhead. But if really what you're trying to do is develop just a set of coordinated activities, you may not want to actually push people all the way to collaboration, because you may actually be developing a more rich sense of collaboration than you actually need. And again, this is just sort of the model from the paper, so it just sort of outlines kind of the cycle by which common ground develops, emphasizing it's kind of got both individual and group components, as well as different influencing factors like context, things like that, policy rules that influence how common ground actually develops. All right, so if we go back to the definition, so I said, if somebody asked you what your definition of collaboration is, what would you come up with? Madhu Reddy, as graduate student, Laziki and myself, we wanted to do a study that sort of brought together everything that the two of us had done. So we said, okay, let's do a study, let's do a review, and look at what people have actually done with respect to health information technology design to try and support collaboration. So the first thing we needed to do was come up with a definition. So we like the definition that Charlene Weir's group came up with a few years back, where they say, collaboration is something planned, but can also be something spontaneous, so it's not always predictable. We've got some sort of information exchange, which again can be explicit, like verbal, but it can also be implicit through shared understanding, emotions, etc. And the thing that we liked about this definition was that it really emphasized that a lot of collaboration is about developing and testing common understanding, developing and testing rules of engagement. Because again, a lot of time these rules don't just happen overnight, but rather there's a process or a series of back and forth by which how they develop. So then from that, what we did was we came up with this notion of collaboration space, because what we were interested in doing again was trying to put some bounding with regard to how people should study collaboration. So what we did was, within the collaboration space, we looked at the technologies, we looked at the context, we looked at the process, and then subsequently the outcomes that were involved in collaboration. So again, from the systematic review, this is sort of the four concepts that we came up with, that we said, we know these aren't perfect. We may certainly have, there's other things we could have included, but we said this is probably a pretty good starting point that gives people some tools to go and try and study collaboration in different settings. So as we started looking through the papers, there was really two things that struck us. One was a very, very high percentage of them never actually defined collaboration in the studies. So, in doing systematic review, we had all these papers that talked about collaboration, but very, very few of them actually defined it. So, they were talking about collaboration, they may have been talking about technology design to support collaboration, but yet, they didn't actually say what collaboration was. So collaboration was it was out there, but they didn't really say, what they were explicitly designing for. The other thing that we found interesting was there's a model called the 3C model of collaboration that came out of computer supportive cooperative work, where it says collaboration actually consists of kind of three precursors, so communication, coordination, and cooperation. What we found in a lot of the papers was also that even though people may have been thinking they were talking about collaboration, a lot of them may have actually been referring to communication, and they may have been referring to coordination. So even though the paper was on collaboration, we'd read it and we'd look at it and we'd say, I'm not sure this is actually collaboration, because they're not getting at things like sort of the development and the exchange of rules of engagement and the development and exchange of shared knowledge. Some of the papers were really strictly talking about just coordinating activities. So again, one of the main takeaways in sort of developing this model was there's a need for a common definition, but also people need to recognize that collaboration on its own is comprised of multiple parts. And if you're talking about coordination, that's okay, but it's not the same as talking about collaboration. So again, this is sort of what we came up with in the collaboration space model. And I think the main things to point out in the model is that certainly technology is a part of it. So as we design systems, technologies, that's a key part of supporting collaboration, but it's really only 1/4 of the model. You also need to understand the context around where collaboration takes place. Obviously, the different processes like communication, different workflows that people do is important to consider. And then probably the most important factor, the most important consideration in the model is the outcomes itself, because again, that allows us to evaluate whether or not the technologies we may design to support collaboration are actually doing what we intended. So, if one of our goals of collaboration is to try and establish common ground, in a clinical unit, in a department, etc., then that outcome really needs to be the driver for the technologies we produce to try and support collaboration in this particular setting. Again, recognizing that different collaborative settings may have different outcomes, which will subsequently drive how we go about designing to try and support these different settings. So what does this tell us about collaboration? Well, certainly, designing for it is complex, because collaboration, designing for collaboration is a very complex task. It certainly has technological engineering implications. However, technology on its own is not going to get us to where we want to go. One of the things we definitely need is a better understanding of collaboration in context, and certainly the different spaces that shape how collaboration occurs, so we don't over-engineer for the task at hand. Again, sort of going back to what I said earlier, coordination is a little bit easier than collaboration. I wouldn't say coordination is easy, but coordination doesn't entail the back and forth dialogue. It doesn't entail the kind of the depth of sort of coming up with rules of engagement and things like that. So if coordination is what you want to design a system for, then you don't want to sort of over-engineer and design for collaboration, because you're likely going to entail a lot more work than you actually need. One of the more crucial things is I think we can't design technology faster than the capabilities and the people that actually use it. If you look at systems that we can put in place, there's actually very, very nice systems that can support collaboration, but certainly one of the things that I've identified in all the studies that I've seen is I don't think the people on the clinical units with respect to how they collaborate are probably at the level of some of these technologies. So I think a key aspect really needs to be the development of collaborative processes at the people and process level, in order to make sure they're actually able to use the technology we designed for them. And then I think, if we think about sort of technology or HIT as a disruptive technology, well, we certainly need to understand both the structure and the behavior of the disruption we're putting in. And I think one of the, the main things that we need is, we need bounding in how we do it. We can't simply go into a setting, introduce technology and hope it'll sort of help collaboration, but rather we really need to explicitly design for it. And I think, in terms of designing for collaboration spaces, one of the things we really need is evidence on how to do it. Going back to that Health Council of Canada study that I talked about earlier, we really have very little evidence as to how does designing for collaboration work in different settings? How does a particular context influence how we design for a particular type of collaboration? So, we know it's multidimensional. We know there's different aspects to collaboration. What we really need is that, that evidence book saying, for this type of collaboration, this type of setting, this is probably going to be your ideal type of design. Subsequent to that, I think we need to look beyond electronic health records or CPO systems. Certainly there are tools that can help us in designing for collaboration and tools that can help support collaboration, but again, the technology was just 1/4 of that sort of collaboration space model we came up with, so technology alone won't do it. From the systematic review, one of the other things that we sort of realized was the majority of studies of collaboration came from inpatient hospitals. You know, there were some from community hospitals, but given that a lot of care, you know, certainly in Canada, there's a big push to move care out of acute care settings and get care into the community. So as those really become the predominant settings where team-based collaborative care delivery is going to take place, we're going to need to make sure that we actually shift our research context and spend a bit more time looking at collaboration in some of these changing types of settings. And then sort of, you know, if we just sort of finish up a little bit on that individual collaborative interchange, this is also an area where I think there's a lot of need for research because, again, as you look at the way collaboration happens, I think a lot of our attention really needs to be on how individual behaviors may need to change in the context of supporting collaboration. Because sort of in, you know, in any of the studies that I've done, as you sort of go from an individual to a collaborative team, standards, terminologies, work practices, etc., a lot of time they need to be reconciled. And I think one of the key pieces in that is looking at trade-offs. You know, you get trade-offs anytime you have to go from an individual task to a collaborative task. You know, marriage is a good example. You sort of need to know what you're getting into before you start going into this particular collaborative activity. And when I did the operating room study, I think one of the things that an anesthetist told me was, and this is, any vendors in the audience? Okay. One of the things that he said was when they were sort of talking about the system before they put it in, the vendors were very good about telling them what they were going to gain. So you're going to gain this and this and this. And they thought, wow, that sounds really good. But it wasn't until the system was implemented when, you know, they were in the operating room trying to manage a task with a patient on the table. And so I was doing the study in the OR with them. So, you know, I'm sort of, you know, they're pointing out problems. They said, they told me what I was going to gain, but they never really told me what I was going to lose. And there was actually some tasks that they lost that they were able to do better on paper or better on their old system that they really missed. So I think, you know, they probably would have appreciated much more of an open discussion regarding what some of those trade-offs would have been, because some of the gains that sort of they got, you know, the gains may not have actually been worth some of the trade-offs or some of the losses that they had to make with respect to processes. So that's kind of the end of my talk. So in terms of acknowledgement, you know, I've sort of, you know, cited some of my colleagues on papers. I've got a list of grad students that's way too long to actually list, but they're always a key part of the work I do. And then just a couple of funding sources from both my school and from the Natural Sciences Engineering Research Council of Canada, who sort of fund the work that I do. So I'm happy to answer any questions now, and if you know, want to think of anything, follow up. This is kind of where all my Canadian contacts are. A comment that I always make is if you look at how Facebook, you know, sort of supports the way people connect. I said if we could actually take what people like on Facebook and inject that into healthcare, it would probably go a long ways into supporting collaboration, because it's, you know, it's a fairly simple interface, but you're able to see who's online, you can exchange messages, you can exchange images and things like that. You're able to see, you know, see what's happening with collaborators and things like that. So, you know, to me, it's a nice example of a very, you know, fairly simple, but yet a very functional collaborative tool. You know, you always saw it in fields like, say, in aviation, where you have people working together in a combined space that have to work collaboratively. And certainly, you know, aviation is one example. You know, you see it somewhat in the financial industry. You know, at least in Canada, I think one of the challenges, because we're still a publicly funded healthcare system, you don't really have that market driving change. Whereas if you sort of have a private healthcare system, or even, you know, a private, you know, private industry, you've kind of got the market pushing things, and I think sometimes that makes collaboration move through a little bit quicker. The data quality argument is a very interesting one because, you know, as those of us in informatics know, I mean, we spent so much time developing standards, so SNOMED, ICPC, and things like that, thinking that these standards were going to be the driver of healthcare. But now, if you look at the tools that people use, patients, get data off their Fitbits that they may sync to their primary care physician, and you can track how many steps people are taking, or you can use, apps on phones to track, diets and things like that. So I think it's a double-edged sword because it enables you to get better connectivity to your patients, but I think it also threatens to erode all that work we did on developing standards because, all of a sudden, we're not using SNOMED solely, but rather we're getting data from a Fitbit and from an iPhone. So I think the standard discussion, I think, is a very significant one. Because it's like I said, it's a double-edged sword. You're getting more data, but then the risk is you may not get quality data. Whereas if you sort of wait for quality data, you could be waiting forever. The majority of the work that I did, at least my initial work, it was, I was doing focus groups, interviews, observations, like, watching an anesthetist using a system in the operating room and having him or her, burn my ear off with things they didn't like about the system. What we're trying to do with the structural work is then trying, really turn it a little bit more mixed methods. So saying, okay, we know that there has to be a quantitative component to this. So the ontology work, it's still a bit preliminary, but we're just starting to move into multi-agent systems and trying to actually develop the behavioral aspects of the system. We're actually trying to use first-order logic to define the behavioral rules. So we're sort of trying to at least quantify the structural component as much as we can. But studying the behaviors, that really requires a qualitative approach because unless you go in and talk to practitioners and sort of see how a team comes together and how they seem to get better at sort of developing, common ground over time, it's really hard to do that in a way other than qualitative. But, mixed methods is sort of ideally what we'd like to do. It's a huge challenge, and I mean, in Canada, they've sort of, the hospitals have had more independent EHRs and systems like that, but now they're starting to move into, they're all bringing in Cerner and Epic. So, and I think a common, complaint that we often hear is that regardless of what we say, if they get half of what they want on an interface, they actually think that's a pretty good victory. So I think you're right. I mean, I think as we learn more about how to design and how to evaluate for collaboration spaces, it's going to present a significant challenge because regardless of how well we think things should be designed to work, if the vendors don't want to do it, then what do we do?
So it's interesting. Informatics has really moved from a place where in the first 20, 30 years we built our systems in our organisations and were quite innovative, and now it's all commercial and the capacity to innovate is zero.
I think similar to the overall research on collaboration, I think the evidence on it is still somewhat limited, although, a lot of the, the early work that we've done and even studies that I've seen in at conferences, I mean, it seems to be well received because I think for the longest time there was almost thought that being more patient participatory would be resisted by the clinicians because it'll lead to workflow issues and things like that. But at least with the physicians that we've interacted with, I think they tend to be very favorable to it because I think they find it helps to move care along a lot more efficiently because I think the more active that you can get patients, the more proactive they can be it some of this collecting data and things like that. I think that can only be a good thing. Certainly in primary care and chronic disease management, I mean, that would be an obvious area where I think the better the patients can be at, tracking medications, tracking diets, tracking, if they're told to go, do a particular type of therapy or follow a certain diet, the better they can be at sort of, I think, tracking what they do to enable clinicians to see, are they following what they're supposed to do? I mean, I think that can always be a good thing. I think even in surgical areas, like when I did the operating room study, so I sort of spent time in all the perioperative areas. So when I was in the pre-admit unit before the patient, when they first meet the surgeon and the anesthetist, these patients, sometimes the elderly ones, they'd come up with these bags of medication. because they need to find out, track what medications they're on to sort of see whether there'll be complications from anesthesia. And they would have these bags, like with pills, and they literally slam the bag down, and the anesthetist is going through the bag. Okay, you're on this. This won't matter. You don't take this 2 days before the surgery. Stop this a week before. And I was kind of thinking, holy mackerel, this is like primitive. So I think even something as simple as that, like tracking medications, I think could go a long way towards reducing patient safety issues and other types of errors and things like that. The one study I pointed out, and I've actually seen a whole bunch of them, they actually say that, kind of informal, quote, cheap talk is actually, the predominant communication means on healthcare units. So even though, we may structure, an electronic patient record or a system to sort of have slots for communication, most of it still happens in notes and memos and in hallway conversations. So I think, we need to really do a better job of trying to understand and trying to facilitate that informal communication as best we can, because I don't see it going away anytime soon. I think ultimately it supports it, because a well-functioning team, even if there's even if a large part of their communication is informal, if they're doing it well, ultimately it should lead to better collaboration. The challenge is always, even things like Sylvia pointed out, that as you start changing the team, if people aren't always on the same bandwidth or on the same wavelength regarding communication practices and things like that, that's where it becomes dangerous. If we could keep the same team for years on end, it would be a lot easier to actually design for it. No, and I think, initially I think people thought sort of the grand vision of the electronic health record would sort of be that, that holistic integrator. But as I've sort of said, I think we realized that grand vision, certainly the NHS kind of gave up on it a little bit. Well, they're trying it again, but gave up on their initial iteration. I think it's going to be a lot harder to do that than we anticipated.
So there's some talk now about the medical home, which is the American name, and the idea that it will be this place which looks after you. And of course the Australian GPs say, but isn't that just what a GP is meant to do? So I think people are thinking on similar lines. Whether that's the answer, I don't know. That's been very, very useful. Your talk reminds me of the old saying that we don't just need interoperable technologies, we need interoperable people.
We do, absolutely. Like I think, in terms of collaboration, I think technologies are much more advanced than the people in the processes.
Thank you very much.